Hey fellow trumpeters from the YouTube community. I wanted to make this video to help some people out with an approach that I call the straight line approach. How do you get from point A to point B? Well, you know, as the old saying goes, the way you get from point A to point B is a straight line. Now, if we were to think of that in terms of trumpet playing, a lot of trumpet players, instead of playing from one note to the next or through a series of notes from one to the next within that series, and instead of playing the easiest way from point A to point B, they skip around quite a bit on the instrument. For example, I'm sure you've heard this before. A trumpet player tries to play, but instead something like this happens. Those little cracks that happen right there. Well, what's happening, instead of going from the straight line from point A to point B, we're making it harder on ourselves. And you know, this is just one interval. This is an easy interval of a fourth or a fifth, just using the harmonic series. But now imagine we're trying to go even larger intervals. We're trying to skip an octave or 2 octaves. What happens, instead of playing that note where it needs to be, right? Point A to point B, and I'll explain this in a minute to make it clear. Instead of doing that in that straight line, we do this. We go way above, or we don't do enough. Now, in the case of this interval, for example, if I was to overshoot that, then it would sound like this. Okay? Now, in that instance, I did not do a straight line, right? In terms of a straight line, how can this be summed up in terms of playing the trumpet? Because obviously it's not a straight line, it's one note and then it's another note, right? Well, not exactly. Let's go to the mouthpiece, okay? Now if we play, literally, starting from that G, okay, and then we slide up to the C, and you're going to be careful not to miss any of the partials in between there, right? On the mouthpiece, we can do something that we can't do on the trumpet. On the trumpet, we can't play all that stuff in between the notes, right? The trumpet is based on a harmonic series, and it's going to slot things depending on the series that you're playing. If we're playing on the open harmonic series of C, it's going to slot things within that C harmonic series. Okay, so, but on the mouthpiece, we're unlimited. So this gives us complete control of our air, and if we can gain that complete control, if we can gain that control without any breaks in the airstream, the breaks sound like this, where the air kind of stops or the sound stops. We don't want to have any of that happening. If we can make it completely without any breaks, then we're playing in what I call a straight line approach. You can even think of it as a circle if you're doing a siren, right? That line does not get broken. That's the main thing. There's no break in that line. And if we're thinking of one note that's here, and then another note that's here, well then, let's make a straight line to that note. And the way we can do that is if we go back to the mouthpiece and we play that G again. Oh, my phone just rang. Now we're going to do the same thing in the trumpet. And bear with me here. Pretend that you're not even playing the trumpet at this moment, okay? You're just playing the mouthpiece still, right? So it's the same concept as playing the mouthpiece. Now if we use that on the trumpet and we play the same way, it's not going to be the prettiest sound when we go from the G to the C, because we're actually trying to hit all those other notes. And what happens when you do that in the horn, that G is going to find a breaking point before it slots to the C. Now you're not controlling this in terms of saying, I'm going to slot the C here. You're letting the horn do the work for you right now. So let's hear how this sounds then when I do it on the trumpet. Okay, so you see in those examples right there, each time as I went like this on the mouthpiece, as I did that straight line approach, the note would eventually pop out at the C. And note that when I'm doing this, I'm not giving more air. That's not the way that I'm changing on the mouthpiece. The way that I'm changing from a low note to a high note on the mouthpiece is simply by going from a wider airstream to a smaller airstream. using the aperture. It's being controlled by the aperture, and also the tongue raises up a little bit. We've all heard of tongue level exercises, right? Claude Gordon was a big proponent of that. I don't take any one particular dimension and focus on that solely in my trumpet playing. I like to think of that everybody that wrote these method books all had something right to say, and I take it all in the way that I teach and in the way that I play. So I realize that the tongue does have something to do with this, and so does the aperture. In fact, I have another video if you want to check that out. It's called 3 Compressions, in which I detail specifically the 3 compressions used in trumpet playing. But I'm not going to get into that completely right now. But I will say that when I'm going from G back to C and back to G again, that it doesn't require me to give more air as I go up to that C. Going higher does not require more air. It requires a smaller focused embouchure that gives you, and let me say not embouchure necessarily, a smaller focus of air, which is going to make a smaller aperture, which is going to give you faster air. We need faster air for higher notes, slower air for lower notes. And we need more air for those lower notes and less air for the high notes. Now, if we want to play the high notes loud, then that's a whole different thing. Then we have to give more air to produce a louder sound up there. But just to go from low to high, it's very backwards to the way that a lot of trumpet players think, which is their initial response is to give more air, to give more air, right? So when we do that with the diaphragm, we max out very quickly. The diaphragm is not the best compression for those things. So when we're doing this on the mouthpiece, just think dia, like when you're whistling. And then the other thing is if you're looking at my aperture here, this is the low notes in general. I'm thinking of an airstream, say the size of a Bic pen, something thicker, right? It's about here. That's going to be our low G, for example. All right, now if I'm going to do the airstream for the very highest note that I can play, it's going to be more like this, like a pin-size airstream. Notice that the muscles of the face start to they act. They start to get into position, right? Because as we're blowing that smaller airstream, we're locking in to where the high notes actually exist. And everything in between is just a change gradually from that low, wide, open airstream to that small, fast airstream. Okay, so again, just to show you both and show you the transition from one to the next, it's this. And notice as I did that, my lips didn't actually have to roll in and out, right? My lips stayed in the same place from here outward. The chin stayed in the same place. The embouchure has to be stable when we're making this change on the mouthpiece. So when I set my embouchure, and you might want to refer to my second video on embouchure, which details the exact setting of the mouthpiece and how to create this stable setting. But when I set the mouthpiece, and I'm ready to blow, and I have my stable setting made, doesn't require my lips to do this at all, and it doesn't require my air to make some kind of a surge for the higher note, right? I'm doing this only by changing the aperture size, okay, and by maintaining the same airflow, and also my tongue is moving slightly from an ah to an E position, somewhere within that realm of ah to E. Not necessarily E, but maybe ah, right? We do this when we whistle, it's very natural. Now, when we put this into the trumpet, that is when we find, when the trumpet tells us where the next slot is on the note. When we do it in reverse, you're going to hear the pitch drop in pitch before it slots to the bottom, to the next harmonic series below it, right? Then we know where the horn is slotting going downward. So if we do this up and down, okay, just using, like I said, the aperture control by thinking of the air, not thinking of the lips. Doing that will make the lips do this, and we don't want that to happen. Okay, when we set the embouchure, when we set the mouthpiece, that's all the setting we need to do in terms of aperture. From there on, the aperture is controlled by the airstream that we feed it and by the tension in the lips. Okay, so just to show you again. Once you do it fast, then you can speed up that straight line approach, right? And then that gives you the clear, beautiful sounding slur that we want to achieve. And then from there you can also do it very fast, very rapid, very easily. Because the only thing that's controlling that at this point is our tongue, a little bit of change in the airflow, but we're not having to do anything changing from when I say the airflow, I don't mean from the source, not from the lungs or the diaphragm, but the change is happening from the tongue. The tongue, when it goes from ah to e, is changing the airflow from slow to faster, right? And as well, you know, when we are thinking of a wider airstream, our aperture is a little bit more open. When we're thinking of a smaller airstream, the aperture gets a little bit more closed. So these two things allow us to change very rapidly and with a lot of command. So for example, once we get that one interval, then we can start adding more intervals and more intervals. Doing it in slow motion first, then doing it faster. Now let's do it in slow motion, add another interval. Then faster. And then so on and so forth. Now if I do that slowly on the trumpet, on the mouthpiece, it's going to sound like this. Notice there's no breaks. I'm keeping absolute connection. Now every day, the first thing that I do is something similar to that to warm up. I go from about middle C up to high C down to pedal C. In fact, I got this from one of Alan Vizuti's, it was a quote of what he did when he was practicing. I'm not sure if it's in his method books, but I read somewhere online that Alan Vizuti would basically warm up by going from that low C to the high C back down to the pedal C. And this made a lot of sense to me because essentially what you're doing is you're ensuring that your lips are flexible enough to go through the whole register without any break. Essentially, you're able to get that straight line direct approach from point A to point B, anywhere on the horn, right? So again, doing that on the mouthpiece. Right, and I try to get that as clean as I can at the beginning of the day. And then on the horn, do the same thing. So then all the range is connected as much as it can be, right? Then when we get to a piece of music, let's put this into practice. Let's imagine we're trying to play the first study from the end of the Arbin's book, right? And the characteristic studies. Not the solos, but the 14, I think it's 14 characteristic studies. The first one starts like this. Okay, so how do we play this as easy and as efficiently as possible? Well, we can start with this direct line approach, the straight line approach, by simply playing the outline of what those notes are, right? In that phrase, the first phrase there. It's just that. In fact, let's take out the note changes. Let's just play the entire shape. Then we play that on the horn, right? Try to keep the same connection on the horn. Connection is paramount here. If the connection breaks, it's the same thing as if when you're on the mouthpiece, you hear that connection break. You're going to hear a stop in the sound. Now the mouthpiece is not as forgiving as the horn is. That's why it's harder to do these things than the mouthpiece. We go to the horn, we do the same thing. Just the outline, no fingers, keeping the harmonic series just working for us here. Okay, so. Now we don't want to miss any of those partials. When we can get that blow without missing any of the partials, then we add in the fingering, but we don't add in any tonguing yet. We're still trying to keep it as straight line approach as possible. Okay, now that I was able to do it just using my air and keeping connection between all the notes, then I start to add in the tongue. And the tongue, by the way, all it does is interrupt the airflow, right? It chops it up like you're chopping up a roll of sushi, for example. Now, when we do this, make sure that the tongue is not stopping and restarting the air, okay? It interrupts the air. It doesn't stop it, it interrupts. There's a definite difference there. And you'll feel that in the diaphragm. The diaphragm should support all the time, no matter how much the tongue is interrupting. The diaphragm never stops holding the support. Okay, so again, I'm going to play that outline without tonguing, just with the fingerings. And I'm being very careful to keep this direct line approach, the straight line approach. So now I'm going to add the tonguing in. And if we want to do this faster, then it's just a matter of keeping the coordination of the flow going through, of the air going through and not stopping, right? It's the same thing if we do it faster on the mouthpiece. So we do it on the trumpet, keeping that straight line approach. Now that time I didn't use any tonguing, right? But the notes were still clicking out because I was allowing the horn to slot the notes and I wasn't slotting the notes for the horn. That's an important thing. If you can do it one note at a time and figure out how to let the horn slot the notes for you, then you can play things that are usually very hard if we're trying to slot all the notes ourselves. You can play them very easy because you're using the air the way it should be used, right? You're feeding the gas to the horn and you're letting the horn slot for you. And after a while, you start to memorize where those proper slots are, right? Then that makes it easy if you need to skip from one note to another note. But let me go back to the characteristic study for a second. So I did it fast. Now I'm going to do it tongued, right? That, again, just to get the feel of doing the straight line without tonguing it. Now I'm going to keep that feel and articulate. Okay, and then it becomes very easy when I add the tongue as long as I keep the feel of that steady airflow. Okay, now let's skip ahead to wide intervals. Okay, with a wide interval, usually this exacerbates the whole problem even more, right? If we're just going... Now that's a little bit easier because we're doing a straight line and we're allowing the horn to slot every note, and we don't really have to speed up the process to the point where we're skipping from one note to a note that's way up. And what I mean by speeding up the process is, if you were to listen to a great trumpet player doing something like this, okay, that with a good slur, if you were to slow that down, you'd hear a little bit of you'd hear a little bit of that, okay? Because in truth, any connection, true connection between the note, still involves all that material that's in between the two notes, right? If you stop the air connection, then you won't hear that stuff when you slow it down. And over time, you know, at first, hearing those two back to back, you might not really hear the difference. It might both sound... Okay, the two of those right there, the first one didn't really have a connection. The second one did have a connection. And if you didn't hear that, then you're not hearing on that level yet. But once you know what that connection feels like, and you hear someone that's not playing with that connection, you'll hear it right away. They're not connecting their air through the notes. Okay, so the same holds true when we're playing from a low note to a very high note, okay? That same process is sped up so that we don't actually hear the notes that happen in between, but they actually do exist there. If you play them on the mouthpiece, if I'm trying to go from the low C to a high C, okay, now on the mouthpiece, you hear that entire journey from the low C to the high C. However, on the trumpet, say you're playing an exercise and you got to slur from the low C to the high C. Well, this would make most trumpet players freak out when they first see this, right? But instead of freaking out, let's go through it systematically and find out the easiest way to go from point A to point B. All right, so play the low C and then play up through the harmonic series, just the same way you did on the mouthpiece. Now let the trumpet slide it for you. We're going to do this in slow motion. Now once you do it, you can go back and forth. You find the connection, and then you can try to do it faster and slower and faster and slower. When you do it faster, you're going to get the interval nice and clean, like a slur. When you do it slower, you're going to hear all that stuff in between. That's just the one octave, right? Then we add the other octave. So right there I had a pretty clean interval of 2 octaves, and it didn't feel very hard to me at all. And the thing that made it easy was I was playing in a straight line from point A to point B. And now when you have to tongue something like that, it's the same exact thing in terms of feeling of your air support, but the only thing that's changing is that we chop the articulation, or we chop the air rather with our articulation. Okay, so I hope this helps you understand a little bit more about getting from point A to point B on the horn in terms of using less effort. Okay, one thing that can also help with this is as you go higher, play softer. At first anyway, right? When I'm playing that same exercise from the Arbin characteristic study, I'm going to back off. When I was doing that on the mouthpiece, I was backing off as I went higher. Now this is counterintuitive to how most trumpet players would approach this at first. They're going to give it more air, but like I said before, you don't have to give more air from the diaphragm when you're going higher, only if you're trying to go higher and louder, right? So at first, let's take away the need to play louder and take away that crutch of having to play louder to play higher, right? Because you can only do so much with the diaphragm before you top out in terms of your high range. So again, when you're approaching the higher range, go softer at first. What that's going to do, as you play softer, your aperture naturally gets smaller. And guess what? A small aperture is the same kind of aperture that we use to play high. A large aperture is the same aperture that we use to play low. Okay, so if in practice as you go higher, you allow yourself to go softer, okay, it's going to be setting you up at the same time to play more efficiently in the higher register. And from that point on, it's just a matter of putting more air behind those notes. Okay? So again, using that same approach, playing softer as I go higher. Making sure not to squeeze the lips together, but to allow the aperture to simply come in, right? From going from a wide aperture, okay, to a smaller aperture by thinking about air. When I do that on the mouthpiece, I do the same thing on the horn, going softer as I go higher. Right, I'm backing off. I hope that comes through on this video because sometimes the microphones attenuate the sound and make it even out as you go higher. But I'm actually definitely playing softer as I go higher. So now I'm going to play that exercise again, or play the music. Now you see, as I went up higher, I relaxed, I let the aperture come smaller. This is going to be another thing that's going to really help you go from point A to point B efficiently. Once you get it soft like that, then of course you can put the air through it, and you're going to have to increase the air as you go higher, only because we're trying to play with the same volume, right? Or louder volume. But to do that immediately, right off the bat, is going to cause you most likely to force and to rely only on the air from your diaphragm to get you to go higher instead of using these other types of compressions. Again, watch the compressions video, the 3 compressions video. And if you're only relying on compression number 1, which is the air from the source, right, turning on the hose, that's not going to be enough, folks. So anyway, I'm Charlie Porter signing off. This was a discussion on the straight line direct approach from point A to point B. I hope that you found this helpful. If so, please subscribe. Click the button. If you are a subscriber, thank you, and good luck and happy practicing. Take care.